Connor.
Thanks, Sarah. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Very well.
Sorry, I can't hear anything now.
We can hear you well.
Are you muted?
No, I'm not muted. This thing is green.
Can people hear me? Wave if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Hi, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks particularly to ODI for setting this up. It was quite hairy yesterday. I was working in the community where someone was shot dead, and it was quite difficult to get out. So I was in a lot of doubt about whether or not I was going to be able to participate today. So I'm very glad and grateful for you for giving me this opportunity. I'll be quite brief, just to give an overview about my work, and then just a couple of thoughts. I've lived in Brazil for over 10 years now. I'm married to a Brazilian. I teach a course at the university on conflict and international law. But my background is a humanitarian aid worker. Before Brazil, I was working in Afghanistan, and before that, I was working in Kosovo. And so I approach things very much from a humanitarian standpoint. The language that Sarah was using, talking about war zones and conflict and IHL rules and refugees and displacement and IDP crisis, is very much the language that I'm familiar with. And I continue. I mean, I've worked as a consultant I've been doing some work for the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations on the protection of civilians over the last 2 or 3 years. And I travel quite frequently into and out of conflict zones. And that sort of language and those sorts of concepts are very much part of my DNA. And I think that comes from the fact that the leading humanitarian organisations, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the UN High Commission for Refugees, start from humanitarian law and refugee law. That's the way in which we analyse our work, and we analyse who we're working for. But actually that's quite outdated. I mean, it's quite a limited and outdated way of looking at the world and looking at conflicts. And I think that conflicts in urban areas bring that home to us very clearly. Brazil, by any standards, is an incredibly violent society. There's between 40,000 and 60,000 people get shot dead here every year. So that's equivalent to or higher than Syria, one of the most violent countries in the world. If you look at the conditions in the favelas, as I said, I was working in one at the moment in Complex de Maré, they look like war zones. I mean, there's soldiers there pointing their guns at people. There's kids carrying submachine guns. There's people are very heavily armed, and there's an air of tension and menace. But I don't think that, and also if you look at the prisons in Brazil, a lot of them are controlled by criminal gangs, and the conditions in them clearly are subhuman, and they're massively overcrowded. Yet in all of that violence, I don't think anyone would think of the violence in Brazil as anything other than a human rights crisis. For us, the problems are, we analyse them as the rights of people. How do we defend the rights of people? And that's a modern way of looking at conflict. When you talk about refugee law or humanitarian law, the rules of engagement in humanitarian law are very different. Some people say Brazil's a war zone, the police should be given the right to shoot criminals dead. That's clearly a very reactionary argument. Yet that's what it applies in conflict zones. If you have the Geneva Conventions, you have the right to kill enemy combatants. When I do training for UN peacekeeping soldiers, I always say to them, and what gives you the mandate to use force? And they will say, well, Chapter 7 in the Security Council, that's right, that's the jus in bellum for the use of force. And then what's the jus in bello? What controls your rules of engagement? And they all say international humanitarian law. And I say, but are you parties to a conflict? And they say, no, we're peacekeepers. So when you use force, actually, you can't just shoot to kill people. You should be using force under human rights law with the positive and negative obligations of human rights law. That's the positive obligation to protect life and the negative obligation not simply to shoot people unless it's as a last resort. And that training is almost entirely absent. I think the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations accepts that IHL applies to its operations, but it's never accepted. There's no Secretary General's bulletin saying that human rights law is the applicable law for UN peacekeeping soldiers. We as aid workers, we think a lot about refugee law because we've worked for UNHCR or we've implemented UNHCR projects. I remember going to UNHCR, or refugee law applies obviously to refugees from outside the country, but as Sarah said, in many, many situations, people who've been displaced from their homes but haven't crossed an international frontier, we call these people IDPs, internally displaced people. When I was working in Afghanistan, the mandate of the organisation I was working with was to help refugees, returnees or IDPs. And so we would do kind of mini status determinations of people to say, are you a genuine IDP or have you moved here just for economic reasons, as you do when you're determining whether someone's a genuine refugee or not. And that seemed strange. I mean, it seemed strange in Afghanistan at the time, and it often meant that we were saying, well, we don't want to, the majority of IDPs obviously go to cities. I mean, that's a general phenomenon, particularly where the conflict is taking place in a rural area. People go to the cities. But because we start from a position of refugee law, that the optimal, durable solution for a refugee is to be able to return to their place of origin, that sort of assumption gears a lot of our thinking about IDPs as well. People will return to their area of origin, which is the rural area. And of course, that doesn't happen. If you look at the world every day, every year, more and more people are moving to cities. Urban areas are expanding and rural areas are depopulated. That's happening right across the world, but obviously it happens quicker when you've got a conflict in a rural area. Yet, if our ideal solution is that people will return to rural areas, it's clearly illogical. It's not going to happen. And I remember going to, from Afghanistan, I went to Colombia, and I was doing some interviews in one of the IDP camp around Bogota, and talking to people there, and people were saying, these are IDPs, they left their home because of violence. When the conditions improve, they may well go home. Well, that's clearly not going to happen. These people are not ever really going to return home. And I think if you look at the majority of IDP camps in the world today, they're either clumped around cities or they're going to become cities. So they're exactly the sort of areas that we have now here in Rio de Janeiro, the favelas, which are clearly are not IDP camps. These people are never going to go back to rural areas. They didn't flee because of violence, but they do suffer the same problems. They suffer the problems of lack of social amenities, lack of electricity, lack of paved roads, lack of proper policing, and that's why they become centres of crime. So I think what's interesting to me, comparing my work in Brazil, which I see clearly in human rights terms, and then what I do as a humanitarian aid worker using a different set of paradigms, is that we're getting one of them wrong. Either we should stop thinking about conflict zones and humanitarian crisis in humanitarian terms and start thinking about them in human rights terms, or we should change the paradigm and say, okay, well, if you have a conflict zone, if you have 60,000 people dead in a country like Brazil, that's a conflict zone, so we should be applying a humanitarian paradigm to that. In my opinion, though, I think the human rights paradigm is a far better one, and I think that means we as humanitarians in the field today need to start thinking differently about how we approach our work.
Thanks, Conor, and we'll come to this discussion about the different... Can you mute yourself? Thanks. The different approaches by humanitarian, human rights actors, development actors, and whether these labels, especially in an urban environment, really make much sense. But I want to broaden the discussion to also, ask our panelists about we've heard a lot about insecurity increasing in towns. Is there any city where actually we've seen a reverse trend? Maybe I can ask you, Jaideep, is there, can you give examples of where we've seen the opposite trend and what has led to that trend and what that would mean for development intervention, so humanitarian intervention, but external intervention, say?
Sure. Let me preface my answer with a little bit of contextualization. I mean, we do need to be aware that by referring to this violence as urban or violence that occurs in cities, we are in some manner territorializing it, and in that there's a sort of an inherent danger in sort of not recognizing the violence that does occur in rural context. Some of the sort of dynamics that Connor was just mentioning. And so we do have to be sort of cognizant that cities do cities themselves are placed in a context that sort of shares interdependencies with the rural areas around them. And certainly with, in terms of the types of dynamics of insecurity and violence that we're talking about, there's a number of channels through which these interdependencies occur. I mean, migration is one, but also, conflict that is primarily rural can have cities as one of its objectives. The control of cities becomes quite key in certain contexts, as we've seen. And so when we speak of urban violence or violence in cities, there has to be a little bit of nuancing in terms of violence that occurs to cities, for example. So cities can be under siege, violence that occurs within cities. And perhaps in some sense, we've all spoken of violence that's inherent to cities, some sort of predisposition to violence, which can be, which is an area that's quite critiqued in this literature, definitely. Now in that context, and let me get to your question in terms of examples where insecurity has decreased. And off the top of my head, I can think of a few. And I was trying to, as I was contextualizing it, I was trying to think of a typology. And the best I could come up with was bad examples, less bad examples, and perhaps examples that are verging on good, that may have some sort of sustainable element to them. To make it a little bit more exciting, I guess I won't tell you which category these examples belong in, but hopefully it'll be quite obvious. I mean, one... So if you look at it historically in South Asia, one of the that I mentioned earlier, in the city of Mumbai, the early 80s, mid 80s, early 90s, really, the city police took it upon themselves to deal with the growing gang culture in the city. There were 3 or 4 predominant gangs, the D Company being the main gang that was starting to control very significant areas of the city and therefore having quite a large revenue base. And they essentially went on a killing spree, where about the numbers are sort of unofficial for obvious reasons, but about 900 to 1,000 gang members were killed by a sort of unofficial police squad called the Encounter Squad that didn't exist on paper, but there were a few very prominent policemen that got quite a lot of media notoriety for having killed 80, 100, 150 gang members each. I've spoken to a number of them now, and they still continue to be city celebrities because they brought peace to the city. And in many ways they did. The type of gang culture that was prevalent in the mid-80s and 90s in Mumbai, which you might have read about in books like Maximum City and to some extent Slumdog Millionaire, etc. That sort of culture has died. Pardon the pun, but so that's one example where you could perhaps categorize insecurity in a city as decreasing. Another example that I often sort of draw on is further back in time, but also relating to Mumbai. In if you think back to in 1984 when Indira Gandhi was assassinated. One of the cities that was most likely to break out into communal rioting was Mumbai because of the Sikh population there. Indira Gandhi, for those who might not know, was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards, and so there was a huge anti-Sikh sentiment that took over the country, and indeed Delhi and other cities saw the brunt of anti-Sikh violence. But in Mumbai, the then police commissioner essentially went and arrested, sort of preemptively, pretty much any and every socio-civil group that they could think of at the time, and put them in sort of preemptive police custody. And lo and behold, the city didn't witness the type of violence that Delhi did. So again, there's questions to be considered about the sustainability of this type of an intervention, but it did result in significantly reduced insecurity. Of course, in more recent times, there have been some very interesting and encouraging sort of interventions that have taken place. And if you look at Latin America, for instance, the city of Medellin, where under the sort of guidance of two very key personalities who were mayors, dramatically reduced the level of violent crime. And in similar story in Lagos, for instance. In Medellin, the story is very closely related with particular interventions in terms of infrastructure. Neighborhoods that were formerly disconnected with cities and were seen as neighborhoods where particular types of violent crime occurred, were connected through a monorail system. And sort of many of these interventions were championed by the mayor. Having said that, there's a lot of and if I've got a couple of more minutes, there's a lot of 1 more minute. Okay, there's a lot of debate in terms of whether there are some sort of essential characteristics of urbanization that are somehow inherently linked with violence. And so, the presumption there is if you want to deal with violence in cities, reduce insecurity, we need to deal with urbanization. And that needs to be problematized. There's been many theories that link fast or rapidly growing cities with insecure outcomes. That's the case in some parts of the world, not all. For instance, in India, the megacities and the fastest growing cities actually have the lowest crime rates, and it's tier 2 towns and cities that have relatively lower growth rates that are the most crime-ridden. Kochi, for instance, and in states like Kerala, where you would not assume violent crime to be quite high. In tier 2 towns and cities, it does tend to be. So it needs to be sort of problematized and nuanced with those points in mind. Sorry for a long-winded answer.
No, that's okay. And I want to go to Caroline, because you've been working on these issues for 40 years, so it'd be really useful if you could tell us what have you seen policies and programs implemented that had particular success in cities in reducing insecurity, but also over these 40 years, have you seen the attitudes and the understanding of these issues changed by
I think
external actors?
The understanding we're hearing about from very different contexts in this workshop. I think the first thing I want to say is that we shouldn't over sensationalize it, and there is a tendency to do that. And I think that Brazil and what you're experiencing in Rio is horrendous and on a daily basis. But it's not the whole world, and it's not all the world's cities. What's happening in places like that, the critical issues that are happening is, first of all, the conflicts are no longer in rural areas, they're now in urban areas. And because they're in urban areas, then they're sort of the classic armed conflict that the humanitarian community is involved in. The humanitarian community is now working in violence in urban areas. And the way that they generally work is somewhat different from other people who come from other contexts. So I think it's really important to say that 2 or 3 issues, if we recognize that not all cities are like, the extreme and really traumatically difficult context that you're talking about, we also need to recognize that there are large numbers of cities where there's a lot of violence that goes on, and a lot of people live very comfortably. Thank you very much. Because within cities, it's who are violent and where's the violence going on. And it's not that the whole city, unless it's in a conflict zone, that it's the whole city. I think, of course, I know all about guarded-gated communities and security systems and so on and so on and so forth, which are used to protect large number of people. And there's a lot of debate, very, very interesting debate, about what that does to cities and what that does to growing marginalization and exclusion of populations. But again, so the second thing is that not all cities, inside cities, different things go on. I think a third issue is, and I should have said this earlier, there's a guy called Daniel Esser who's done some very interesting work in Kabul. And he did some work 10 years ago, and I asked him to write something recently for me. And what he said was what was so fascinating was fascinating is the right word, that the infinitesimal, brutal, sensationalized killing that goes on in terms of the global agendas or the political agendas totally invisibilize the far more appalling, gratuitous, daily violence within households, and not just gender-based violence between men and women, but also the abuse of kids, particularly boys. So when you talk about this issue of violence, it's like you're talking about, first of all, that cities are very different, and then you're talking about a whole continuum of different types of violent behaviour. And I think our colleague who's now disappeared from Chicago, very interesting to know which are the sorts of people that he's having success working with, because they're very different. So finally, to give you a couple of examples, I mean, there are micro-level examples, and they're wonderful, but the problem about them is they are invariably short-lived. So I pulled together some stuff recently. There's very good examples of Central America on policing. El Salvador. Look at El Salvador today. Nicaragua, fantastic example of a country in Managua that really got its policing through community policing. Actually, in their case, because they had like 20 years of donor funding from the Swedes to really, really change how local policing worked. Is it the same today? I don't know. I was intrigued to hear about Honduras, that they're working in Honduras. We've just cancelled going and working in the slums in Honduras because they are so dangerous that even I don't want to even go there. And as you very kindly said, yes, I have been working on these issues, and I'm used to go living in slums, and I've done it for 40 years. So there are places. And finally, and I liked your referencing, I think we do need to understand governments, local government. It's not just an issue around infrastructure and housing and the sort of issues we had a discussion on this morning. It's also about security issues. And I liked your example, and I was going to give the example of Bogota, because I work a lot in Colombia, and Colombia is a country which you guys say is in conflict, right? And you work on humanitarian issues. But I've been working in Bogota since the 1960s, and it always has had violencia. And actually, there's a very interesting example that Bogota is a city that has actually lowered its levels and how do you measure violence, by the way? So lowered its rates of killings through amazing set of different mayors picking up and taking on and continuing the same policy. And I'm doing a range, again, there's not one intervention, a range of interventions, and I'm going to finish because I don't want to trivialize. But I mean, the mayor of Bogota had a policy whereby all the men had to stay in one night of the year. They were not allowed to go out. Everybody rolled with the laughter. The men got very angry. Guess what? There were less killings. I mean, surprise, surprise. So I'm just saying, we've got to be really careful how we deal with this issue, what we're talking about and where we're talking about it. So there are wonderful examples of success. Sadly, they don't, because the macro structural issues aren't going away. And if you're not going to deal with those and look at the redistribution of resources and all these things that have to go on, as much around the issues we were talking about as about insecurity and daily living, they will remain with us, I think.
That leads me to a question for all four of you before we go to we open it up to everybody from the audience. We've seen over the last few years, as we've heard, an increased interest of humanitarian organizations to operate in urban violence, almost a push, to say that if you look at the level of homicides, the level of violence in a number of these cities, actually this points to the necessity for a protection role of humanitarian organizations, or a presence in responding to the vulnerability and the lack of safety of people in this context. We've seen MSF, Doctors Without Borders, the ICRC starting programs in countries that were not a war, but where there were cities with large caseloads of violence. What would you say is, before humanitarians continue to expand their role, needs to happen in making sure that we don't transfer some of the typical approaches that we've seen in other settings when the Humanitarian International takes over in a number of contexts?
Can I respond?
You can start, and then we go to the others.
When I heard this discussion going, I thought, could we do housing policy in the same way? Like we used to come in, the Northerners, and we give high-rise flats to Caracas. And then the Venezuelans said, oh my God, no, we better have self-help. And then somewhere in the middle comes social housing. And how does this work in these sorts of issues? I think that there are fascinating examples, and I want to just have 1 minute to show it, which are about South-South learning and collaboration. And that's where I think that the sort of examples that you're talking about are really incredibly meaningful. I happen to have had the honor of knowing this outfit, which you must know, called Viva Rio. And Viva Rio has been working for 20 years grappling with this issue in urban Brazil. But what they've also done is they've taken that and they've transferred that knowledge, and they're now working in Haiti. And they've had to work in a totally different way in Haiti. Urban Haiti is extraordinarily dangerous. And what they're doing there, and I just felt it was so exciting to learn, is they're trying to do three things at the same time. They're trying to reduce levels of community violence. They're trying to manage the violence that's there, but they're also trying to transform the conflict. And they're working with the gangs. And they are doing sort of crazy things like incentive systems, that if you don't have a killing in the community for 1 month, 5 people get to go to school. If you have no killing for 2 months, somebody gets a motorbike. We are working in a global, and again in the previous session, we had Price Waterhouse, I don't know if they're still here, but we had wonderful financial incentive questions about things. It's the same in all these businesses. So I think that it's the tracking of this type of South-South knowledge sharing where people really understand the culture. Why is Brazil in Haiti? Because the Brazilians are peacekeepers in Haiti, and the Brazilians think Haiti is somewhere they feel very strongly about. But it has allowed that space. So it's models that are local, that are community driven, but are quite realistic about what you can and can't do and who you do and don't work with. So that's just to